Okay, so today we're going to dive right into it. A really, really critical chapter of history, and one that's often super intensely debated.
Yeah.
We're talking about the establishment of Israel and what happened to the Palestinian population during that process.
Big topic.
It is a big topic, and we've got some really dense source material here to help us.
We do.
And what we really want to do with this deep dive is kind of get past the headlines, you know what I mean? The kind of like the ingrained narratives that we hear all the time, and really understand some of the deeper mechanisms that were going on historically during this period.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's so easy for these discussions to just sort of get stuck at the level of like, oh, this is, ancient religious hatreds or, kind of this primordial ethnic animosity. And, while those things obviously exist and they're part of the story.
They're part of the picture, yeah.
What we're really trying to do is unpack, the kind of deeper structural forces and the specific political choices that really were the engine of this dispossession, and that's something that I think the sources we have really give us the tools to do.
Well, let's get right into it then, because even just looking at, sort of the background here, it's clear that it wasn't like one single event or one single cause that kind of led up to this moment. We're talking about, the long history of European colonialism in the region. You have the simultaneous rise of both, Zionist and Palestinian nationalism.
Competing nationalism.
Competing nationalisms exactly at the same time.
Yeah.
You have great power politics, constantly in play.
Oh, yeah, always.
And then, of course, the absolutely seismic impact of the Holocaust. So it's a really complex intersection of a lot of different major global forces.
It really is, yeah.
And to really get it, and I think we need to, like you were saying, focus on the structural dynamics.
Yeah.
Not just like isolated actions or individual, bad feelings or something like that.
It's not about just, the sort of the surface level stuff. It's about, what's the underlying kind of logic of the situation.
Exactly. And one of the things that our sources really emphasize is that this whole concept of settler colonialism provides a really, really useful framework for understanding this.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's important to sort of, for everyone to understand that settler colonialism is different than, say, like extractive colonialism.
Right.
Which I think a lot of people are more familiar with.
That's the kind of classic, go in, take the resources.
Right, exactly, yeah. Just strip the place for whatever it's worth.
Ivory diamonds, whatever it is.
Exactly. Yeah. And the sources we have really hit on this. It's not just about exploitation with settler colonialism. It's about replacement.
Replacement, yeah.
The goal is to establish a new society on that land, and that inherently involves a different relationship with the existing population than just sort of,
Yeah, if you're just extracting resources, you don't necessarily need to get rid of everyone who's already there.
Exactly. Yeah, you just need to exploit them.
Yeah.
But this is something different, and it leads to this, I think, really challenging and important idea that comes from Patrick Wolf, this idea of the logic of elimination.
Right.
Can you kind of walk us through what that is and how it applies in this context?
Sure, yeah. So Wolf's concept of the logic of elimination is basically the idea that in settler colonial situations, the removal of the indigenous population isn't like a side effect. It's not, whoops, we kind of, did some bad stuff.
Right.
It's actually like baked into the whole project.
It's fundamental.
Yeah, it's fundamental. The underlying goal is to clear the way, demographically, politically, economically, for that settler population to become the dominant group. Now, this doesn't always mean like outright physical extermination, although violence is often a tool.
Right, of course.
More broadly, it's about dismantling existing, societal structures, breaking that connection of the indigenous people to the land. So it's, it's not just about governing, it's about fundamentally reshaping who lives on that land.
Okay, so applying this logic of elimination to the Palestinian experience then.
Right.
The Nakba, which I think most people are familiar with as the sort of mass displacement of Palestinians in 1948. The sources really point out that this wasn't just like a tragic outcome of war or, just sort of something that happened. It was connected to this very fundamental aim of creating a Jewish state with a Jewish majority in a region that was overwhelmingly Arab.
Right.
Like that wasn't an accident. It was sort of tragically a key part of how that was going to be achieved.
Precisely. And I think, when we start to think about this alongside the development of competing nationalisms, we see this really significant power imbalance, right? So Zionism as a nationalist movement emerges from within a European intellectual tradition and crucially gains substantial support from major imperial powers, Great Britain being obviously the key example here.
The big one.
And this allows for the early development of institutions, political organization, and ultimately significant military capacity.
Yeah, that backing from imperial power seems like such a crucial piece here because
Absolutely.
on the other hand, Palestinian nationalism is developing as a movement of resistance against colonial rule.
Exactly. It's anti-colonial.
It's anti-colonial,
Yeah.
right? So they're not just contending with like this incoming Zionist settlement project.
Right.
They're also at the same time having to resist the British Mandate authorities.
Absolutely.
Right. And the sources detail how, Palestinian institutions and leadership face repeated suppression and weakening under colonial rule.
Yeah.
I'm curious, were there any, factions within, I guess, the imperial powers that were like, hey, this doesn't seem fair?
That's a great question.
But how did that play out?
So within the British government, for instance, there were definitely differing viewpoints and kind of shifts in policy over time, driven by all sorts of things, strategic interests, moral considerations, responses to, what was actually happening on the ground. Right. But the overall commitment to the Balfour Declaration and this idea of a Jewish national home for a really complex mix of reasons, remain this really significant factor shaping the political landscape. And so you have this asymmetry in terms of external support and internal capacity that ends up having a far greater influence on how the conflict unfolds than like any inherent cultural or religious differences between the populations.
Right.
It wasn't a level playing field for these two nationalisms to kind of develop and play out.
So it just highlights the massive impact of these structural inequalities that are already in place.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, we have the role of international institutions.
Right.
Which in theory are supposed to be, impartial.
Right, in theory.
Right. But when you look at the historical record, the League of Nations, through the mandate system, basically formalizes British colonial control and incorporates the Balfour Declaration's commitment. Like, that's a pretty significant starting point.
It's
huge. Yeah. I mean, you're already starting from a place where one side is being favored.
Right. And this kind of keeps going with the UN's endorsement of the Partition Plan for Palestine in 1947. And it's crucial to remember that this decision was made without the consent and, in fact, against the strong opposition of the majority of the people living in Palestine at that time who were Arab.
Right. I mean, it's really a top-down kind of imposition.
Yeah. So given these actions by these international bodies, which are supposed to be the arbiters of fairness, and we're seeing that they're actually operating within this like colonial framework, it becomes, I think, clearer why some historians argue for this sort of structural impossibility of a truly equitable outcome at that time.
Yeah, you can't really untangle the effects of colonialism from the mechanisms that are supposed to be creating a solution.
And this is something that we see continuing today with the challenges in enforcing Palestinian rights under international law, right? Absolutely. It's a continuation of this, this complex dynamic.
So when we take all these elements together, there's this framework of settler colonialism where the goal is demographic change. We have the unequal development of these two nationalisms happening at the same time within this really imbalanced context.
Right.
And then you layer on top of that the role of these international institutions, which often are operating within this colonial paradigm.
Yeah.
It leads to kind of a stark conclusion, and maybe an uncomfortable one, but the sources really suggest that Palestinian dispossession wasn't like an accidental byproduct.
Right.
Or just a result of like missteps by one side or the other.
It wasn't just bad leadership or, bad choices. It was something much deeper.
It seems almost structurally inevitable, given the fundamental nature of the project, which was to establish a Jewish majority state in a land that had an existing and significant Arab population.
Right. The goal itself kind of contained the seeds of dispossession.
And the sources really emphasize that Palestinian resistance wasn't just rooted in like animosity towards Jewish people. It arose from these very fundamental anti-colonial principles. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
A demand for the right to self-determination and a desire for democratic governance based on majority rule.
Which, ironically, right, are principles that the material highlights were considered, totally foundational for European nations.
Oh, of course.
But were systematically denied to those under colonial rule.
It's the hypocrisy of the whole thing, right?
Absolutely. A classic colonial double standard.
Yeah, and this brings us to, I think, a really critical point about how this history itself is understood and presented.
Yeah, how the story gets told.
The sources talk about what they call this hegemonic discourse, like a dominant narrative, particularly within, traditional Zionist accounts,
Right.
that often minimized or ignored Palestinian experience.
Sometimes portrayed the land as being basically empty.
Right. Right, like a land without a people.
Land without a people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this narrative sort of presents Palestinian displacement as like a necessary consequence of the Holocaust.
Yeah, as if there was no other option.
Like there was no other way this could have happened.
Right.
And what's really significant is how deeply ingrained these narratives became, right?
Absolutely.
They shaped educational curriculum media portrayals.
Yeah.
I mean, think about how this conflict is talked about in news media across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
And even academic scholarship, particularly in Western contexts.
Right. And I think, pre-existing kind of Orientalist perspectives.
Oh, yeah.
Which we could do a whole other deep dive on.
Yeah, we could.
Really kind of shaped, how Western scholarship approached this and often led to a questioning of Arab agency and political aspirations.
So, basically saying, they weren't really capable of...
Right. They weren't really actors in their own right.
Yeah, exactly.
They were just reacting to, external forces.
But the material also highlights this really important shift that happens in the 1980s.
Yes.
With the emergence of what's called critical Israeli historiography.
Right.
And these are Israeli scholars who start to dig back into the archives and really start to challenge some of these long-held national myths.
Yeah, it's kind of an internal critique.
Yeah, and in doing so, they end up bringing the scholarly understanding of this history much closer to the lived experiences and the historical memory of Palestinians.
Which had been marginalized up to that point.
Yeah, it's a really crucial shift.
It is. It really is. And it really, demonstrated a willingness within Israeli academia to confront difficult truth and to kind of re-examine these established narratives through a more critical lens.
Right.
And to really, incorporate these perspectives that had previously been ignored. And I think, that kind of self-reflection is vital for deeper understanding.
Totally. So, as we kind of synthesize all of this information, our deep dive into these sources really underscores that, the dispossession of Palestinians wasn't simply the result of these ancient hatreds or isolated acts of violence.
Right.
It was the result of this really complex, powerful interplay of historical forces with settler colonialism and these deeply unequal power dynamics acting as, I think, the central drivers.
They were prime movers, yeah.
So as you're reflecting on this historical analysis, it's really crucial to remember that understanding the past, no matter how difficult it is, it doesn't predetermine the future.
Or it doesn't have to, yeah.
And our sources touch on this concept of decolonial approaches that have been explored in other settler colonial contexts around the world.
Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, reparations, land restoration.
So given this understanding of the historical forces at play and recognizing that history isn't destiny, how can we reimagine what those decolonial approaches could look like in the Israeli-Palestinian context?
That's the big question, right?
That's the big question.
How can we take those ideas and apply them in a way that strives for justice for all without creating new injustices?
It's a really profound question to consider. And it challenges us to kind of move beyond just the conventional thinking and really try to envision possibilities for a different future.
Absolutely.
And I think it also emphasizes, the enduring power of these historical narratives and the really fundamental importance of seeking out and considering multiple perspectives.
Always.
When we're trying to understand these really, really complex and challenging conflicts. So thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
It's been great.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a really important topic.
Absolutely.
I'm glad we could dig into it.
Me too.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks.